how do we develop judgment in those future leaders and leaders so that they make good decisions? So this is just a little pop quiz. This is a campaign where a power established their power base, fought a regional rival kind of back and forth, defeated their primary rival, and then there was a final holdout that they eventually beat. So just from this simple operational design, can anyone guess what this campaign might have been? No wrong answer. Well, there is a right answer. Go ahead.
I'm going to, based on the name of this lesson and the shape of everything, probably the reunification of Hawaii.
You win a prize. Great job. So a lot of us don't associate complex operational design and strategy with Hawaii. So correct, this was an overlay of King Kamehameha's unification of Hawaii campaign, fought from about 1782 to 1810 in the Hawaiian Islands that ultimately ended with the Kingdom of Hawaii. I've lived in Hawaii 20 years. I did not understand the complexity of that campaign until I started to do the historical research into it. So we have Kamehameha on the big island of Hawaii, consolidates his power, fights a number of battles that I'm not going to get into. We can talk about them later if you'd like, including a naval battle where the king of Maui, Kahekili, who we'll talk about in a minute, tried to invade the big island. And then a series of complex amphibious operations. So that included, amphibious landings, transporting tens of thousands of warriors in hundreds of war canoes between the islands. Eventually defeats Maui, and then defeats Oahu in 1795. So that's already like 13 years into the campaign. At the most famous battle of Nu'uanu-Pali, which we can talk a little bit more about later. If you've been to Hawaii and you've gone to the Pali Cliffs, that campaign or that battle culminated with up to 800 to 1,000 of Oahu's warriors being pushed over the cliffs of the Pali. Whether they were literally pushed off or choose to jump because they were defeated, we'll never know, because this is pre-contact or pre-Hawaiian written history, right? We're going off oral tradition primarily. Tried to invade Maui. His invasion fleet got sunk in a storm. That's kind of a historical, meme, if you will. But eventually he negotiated with the king of Kauai, who submitted to his authority in 1810. So we're talking a 28-year complex campaign, training forces, developing forces, establishing logistics, coming up with plans, negotiations, battles, that culminated with King Kamehameha being the first king of the Kingdom of Hawaii. So I found that pretty eye-opening when I got into the history of it, because I live in Hawaii. I started to research, what kind of battles do I want to do? And then one day I was like, I kind of have a home field advantage. I live here. I have access to cultural practitioners, the Bishop Museum, University of Hawaii, a lot of sources where I could research it. So this I found pretty interesting. How did Kamehameha develop the ability to think that with that level of complexity without written language? And so I discovered Hawaii has its own strategy game. And this is Konane. This is what's called a papamu. So all over the Hawaiian Islands, primarily along the ocean, and we're not sure why, but there are these stone board games, and these are the pieces called ili ili that are black and white. So it's very Go-like. Unfortunately, when Captain Cook first saw it in 1778, he said, oh, it's like Hawaiian checkers, because it does use a jumping mechanic. But it's very sad from someone who's getting into Konane and talking to Konane practitioners that someone called it checkers, right? Because it's very reductionist. It's like calling Go checkers, right? We all know Go is much more complex than checkers, and so is Konane, even though it has a similar mechanic to checkers. But for Captain Cook, that was the simple mental shortcut to describe it, as he was writing his log. This is a replica of one of Queen Kapi'olani's boards. There are only 6 wooden boards left in existence. 5 are at the Bishop Museum. And Hawaii is having a Konane revival right now. So earlier this year, there was a Konane state championship, and the winner of that tournament won the replica of Queen Kapiolani's board. Go to next. So how I discovered it, not like I discovered Konane. I first found out about Konane sitting on an airplane, flying back from an event in Taiwan, reading a book. And this is what I read. I'm not going to read it for you. Can everybody read it? Or I can read it for you if you can't see it in the back. I'll just give you a minute to read it. Anyone seen the Chief of War? Yeah. So this is the guy who's like half tattoo, really super like badass in that show. So I'm sitting in a plane and I read this part here and I'm like, holy crap. Hawaii had a game of war and this guy, irrespective of the board, he just had piles of those stones outside his house. He would bring his generals in. He would move the pieces somehow, not related to the game, but we're talking like combined arms rehearsal, right? He's doing a sandbox of the battle. And then the key thing for me was the generals just had to go out and fulfill the movement. So he's doing his battle planning using pieces from a game in the late 1700s pre-contact with the US. So that was pretty eye-opening to me that a culture that we as outsiders affiliate with aloha and maybe they had like some primitive forms of warfare. Well, they absolutely did not have primitive forms of warfare. They were limited that they didn't have metals, so they used the materials they had, but they deeply thought about warfare and strategy and operational art. And then another passage in the book that I was reading, which is oral history. So Hawaiians are very focused on mele and traditions and chants, and they memorize all of these things and pass it down generation to generation. And that was through the kahuna. We've all heard about kahuna, right? These were kind of a priestly class, but they were also the advisors to the chiefs. And they, or some of them, also used the stones when they advised their chiefs in battle to talk about this is what the enemy might do, this is how we counter it, this is the terrain we fight in, this is how I'm advising you to win the battle, the war, the campaign, whatever it may be. So these were pretty eye-opening passages for me. So I started to get, and this is only 3 months ago, by the way, I started to get deep into Konane. But I don't think it was like they played Konane and that's how they trained. It was an ecosystem within their culture. So you have Konane oral traditions that pass down battle histories, and they get deep into the battle, even though it's oral tradition. Melees and chants that I mentioned, genealogy, a big thing, they're advisors. And then there's an art called lua. This is the training system for warriors in Hawaii. And it gets into not only the martial art aspect, but the tactics, the formations. Hawaiian armies were not just like a mob of warriors fighting each other. They had the equivalent of squads, platoons, companies, battalions, brigades, all named, all with different strength levels, organized under chiefs, and they probably, because a lot of this is conjecture because it's not written down, used the stones to represent those formations, and then rehearsed battles or talked about battles. And Konane was definitely the art or the game of chiefs. Kamehameha was known to play it for like hours on end. Kahekili was known for, when I play, no one talks, or you're probably dead if you've seen his character in Chief of War. But talking to practitioners, when he did his kind of terrain board before a battle, no one could talk. And one of the practitioners, he used the word like cryptology. I took it as OPSEC. If I don't want a spy to hear my battle plan, I'm doing it in silence with the stones, then my generals go out and execute my plan. Just kind of an interesting aside, but I'm getting a lot of information from cultural practitioners of Konane who are Hawaiians and who are deep, deep into it. And that's where I think through all of these things, their strategic thought was developed to a very high level, and not just with one tool. So Modern Revival, this is Capena Baptista. He won the tournament in February, just before I started to get into it. This is the championship game here, and this is he and I playing on the board. I have yet to win a game with him. I probably never will. When I ask him, he can think typically 5 to 6 moves ahead. He said on a good day he can think 7. I'm lucky if I can think like 1, right, or 2. And so the most interesting mechanic about Konane is even though it has a jump mechanic, you don't win the game by taking all of the opponent's pieces or the most pieces. You win by having the last legal move left in the game. So it's a very different kind of concept in how you play. You can have the opportunity to make double or triple or quadruple moves depending on the size of the board, and the board size is not set. So there are many different sizes of board. You saw the one on the big stone. They can get huge with hundreds of pieces, and so those games could take a long time. But the winning condition is just you have the last legal move left. You may have taken more of my pieces, but if I have the last move left, I still win. And it fundamentally reflects kind of Hawaiian thinking in that the key aspect in Konane is preserving options. So I want to make a move that takes options away from you and leaves options for me, as many options as possible. And that gets into kind of their strategic and tactical thinking. I likened it to, or I thought about, in a lot of Western accounts, not only of Hawaiian warfare, but kind of pre-contact or ancient warfare in general, they would look down on a chief or a leader switching sides or not participating in a battle because we think, or the West thinks in like a Napoleonic alliance system, right? Like you're my boss, you're my king, whatever. I'm gonna die for you. I'm gonna do whatever you say. That doesn't happen a lot in chief type warfare, ancient type warfare. And I was reading one of the accounts of the battles where Kamehameha was fighting his opposition or his rival on the big island of Hawaii. And several of that chief's vassals didn't show up for the battle. And in kind of our Western eyes, we're thinking, well, they betrayed him, that's bad. But they were preserving their options, right? Maybe they were looking at the battle calculus and like, I'm not sure if my chief is gonna win. I don't want to come out openly against him, but if I just stay home, then I'm preserving my options. So it's kind of a different reflection of how they think culturally and in warfare. And it's not necessarily bad, right? It's just that culture. And Capena, he's about 30. He has an anthropology degree from MIT, a Master of Finance, I think from Cal Poly. Super smart, but I'm 61 years old, he's 30, we're playing the game, and I'm like, hey Capena, what about this move? How do I like counter that? And he's like Yoda, right? He's like, when you figure it out, tell me. And every time I ask him something, that's what he tells me. And that's what the other practitioners do as well. So I'm like getting schooled by these very young, smart, culturally savvy Hawaiian players, but they take it very seriously. And then I'll just go back. So he talks about pattern making and pattern recognition, which in our war games, you start looking at operations. How do we do a double envelopment, a single envelopment? These classic things. They have the same thing in patterns on the board. And then teaches consequences. Every choice compounds into the final outcome. So that is Konane. It is definitely an insight into Hawaiian strategy formulation, operational art, and if you recall the campaign, that was operational art executed over almost 30 years that culminated in the unification of Hawaii. So pretty serious, I think. The modern relevance, so I've talked to a lot of the practitioners and educators. I'm kind of getting into that culture very slowly as an outsider and respectfully. But strategy, critical thinking, pattern recognition, resource management. So one of the things that they talked about is the board. The white stones are traditionally coral, which is reflective of the ocean, and the black stones are typically basalt or volcanic rock, which emphasizes the land. And they call the different sides of the board, depending on which color you are, Mauka and Makai, which is ocean side and mountain side. And one of the theories about the different sized boards is that in Hawaii, just like anywhere else, they have like the equivalent of counties, ahupua'a. And so they think like, if I have a county that is large, maybe I have a larger board, and they would figure out on the board, like, well, I'm planting taro here, this field's fallow this year, and they could use the stones to represent that resource management aspect. One of the other theories that they have about why the stone, or why the papamu, the stone boards are along the ocean, is they used it for like fishing, envisioning fishing areas, navigation, astronomy. So there are a lot of things that stones on a board can do besides play the game of Konane. You can also do multiplication on it. They haven't proved that that was what the Hawaiians did with it, but there's a very similar technique with stones on a board in Mayan civilization where you can do multiplication and division. So there's a lot of different uses potentially of the board. Foresight, leadership, decision making. So Konane was absolutely part of chiefly and warrior training. They would play for hours. And one of the most interesting things that I'm exploring is, so this is the board at the start state. It's completely full. It's in a pattern. You can see white row, black row diagonally. So it's easy to set up. However, going through like Hawaiian language newspapers from the 1800s, having AI translate them, and there's another researcher at Kamehameha Schools, there was an opening phase of Konane that we only know a few things about, because when the missionaries came to Hawaii, it was suppressed because the Hawaiians like to gamble playing Konane. So legendarily, up to your life or your wife, but commonly like your canoe, whatever goods, but there was a complex set of wagering and side bets in any Konane game. And so we believe, they believe, I also believe, that there was a lost opening phase that started with the board empty, and then you would have an alternating placement phase. I would place, you would place, until the board was full. And so that can get into deep strategy for a placement phase. And typically in Konane, the corners are the strongest positions because they can't be jumped. The edges are the next strongest, and the weakest is in the middle because that's the most opportunities for your opponent to jump you. So we think there were probably some deep strategic, maybe even regional equivalent of go schools of how you would place your stones. Then when the placement phase would over, the board is pa'a or set. They would cover it with a cloth, I think, so nobody could move the stones, right? Then there was a wagering period, and then the game would start with the jumping phase, or the taking phase that they call it. But over time, possibly, they ended up with the optimal beginning game state for a fair game, not a, I outthought you in the placement phase, and so I have an advantage. But so, we're not sure why, but this is the modern setup for Konane. In 1924, the Bishop Museum sent an anthropologist to try to get the rules of Konane codified so that it wouldn't get lost as Hawaiian culture was suppressed. He found a 90-year-old woman who said, I know how to play Konane, wrote the rules, and this is what we have now. So I have an appointment to go to the bishop and look at his field notes when I get back to Hawaii to try to see exactly what that woman told him and how he distilled that information to the modern game. But so this is modern Konane based on a lot of decades of suppression and it almost being lost. So what we know, me and the practitioners, or what I've derived from them, the Ili definitely plays Konane. Papamu were widespread. You can find them all over the islands. Battle plans have their own name, Papa Konane, which are like Kahekili taking the stones and rehearsing his battle. And Kahekili used the stones, the ile with his generals. So we know that. What we think it might mean is it developed judgment. And we talked about being able to conduct operational design, strategy formulation that culminates in campaigning. Papamu may have had multiple uses. We talked about that. Could have been astronomy, could have been land management, any number of things that you can do on a board with stones with no rules, irrespective of the game. May have informed strategic thought, I'm pretty certain it did, and may have supported battle planning, I'm pretty certain it did. But our challenge as historians, anthropologists, and to some extent archaeologists is we have no written history to go on. I can't find Kamehameha's memoirs and read through them where he talks about Konane. It's all oral tradition and a lot of Hawaiian language newspapers where there was a lot of thought going on. And one of the evidences for strategic thought is as I was going through those newspaper articles, you find references to thinking in Konane terms. So during and after the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, 1871, you could find articles in Hawaiian language newspapers that said like the Prussians were setting the board. They were moving their stones. The same thing when Hawaii was, the kingdom of Hawaii was overthrown and they were talking about annexation. There are references to the queen like positioning her stones on the board as she was sending representatives to Washington to try to undo the coup that happened and that the United States military backed. The same, there were articles on the Great Britain-Germany competition around the turn of the 19th century, the dreadnought competition, the same analogy leading up to World War I. Even references to all the European powers are moving their stones on the board and there's going to be a climactic war soon. So everyone knew in Hawaiian society what Konane was and how to think about it. The newspaper articles just referenced that. But what we never had was someone saying like, well, they did like the Queen's Gambit or they did whatever. Because everybody knew Konane, so they didn't have to explain it. So unfortunately, we don't have, the rules that they were thinking. We just know